First presenter today is Laura Ramsey. Laura is an associate manager of conservation documentation at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where she manages the paper conservation department's image creation, post-processing, and asset management efforts. She holds an MA in film and photography preservation and collection management from TMU and is an adjunct professor at the New York University's Moving Image Archiving and Preservation program. Laura has lectured internationally on digital preservation topics. The title of her lecture today is Human-in-the-disintegration-loop, Digitization and Materiality. Please join me in welcoming Laura Ramsey.
Give me one moment here. This one. Thank you. I have some tech skills. Okay, that's good. All right, good morning. Thank you for that generous introduction, Thierry. I really appreciate the invitation to come back here. This is my home, so it feels really, really lovely to be here with all of you. So my talk this morning will be about the transition from physical archives to digital collections and then into the ecosystem of AI and how that will inform future research. Once understood as material artifacts, photographs are now largely accessed as data points within computational systems, mediated through algorithms that categorize, retrieve, and even reconstruct them. This transformation raises critical questions. What is lost when photographs are digitized? Can computational methods safeguard historical context, or do they contribute to a flattening of meaning? The title of this talk takes inspiration from a concept of human-in-the-loop, a phrase you may have heard before. It's a framework in artificial intelligence where human oversight is integrated into automated processes to help correct errors and mitigate biases. However, as AI becomes the dominant mediator of photographic archives, human intervention often occurs after critical disintegration has already taken place, and oftentimes that disintegration is at the hands of humans themselves. So the first thing I need to address is that I will not be directly discussing the roles of researchers, artists, or any other end user of the archive. Nor will I focus on the keywording or search terms applied to digital assets, but will instead be addressing the role and responsibility of both the archive and the archivist in the role of digitization. So first, why digitize these material objects? Well, the response that I always gave was to democratize access. Easy. The role of the archivist has traditionally been framed as neutral, meaning that archivists are expected to preserve, organize, and provide access to records without imposing personal biases. However, many scholars and practitioners argue that true neutrality is impossible and that attempting to be neutral can itself be an unethical stance in cases where power, oppression, or historical erasure are at play. So these are sort of the 4 steps that I've come to recognize as I've navigated my own role as an archivist and working in imaging. So as a student, first I was introduced to the traditional view. The idea of neutrality in archives comes from the belief that archivists should preserve records impartially without selecting, altering, or suppressing content based on personal or institutional biases, make records equally accessible to all researchers without privileging one narrative over another, avoid interpreting or contextualizing records, leaving this to historians, researchers, and the public. Okay, stage 2, neutrality is a myth. So this idea, many contemporary scholars challenge the very idea of neutrality, arguing that selection is inherently biased. Archivists decide what to collect, how to classify it, what to digitize, and what metadata to assign. Every archival decision, whether conscious or not, shapes historical narratives. Even silence is a bias. So I just have this quote here by Vern Harris. "There is no such thing as an impartial archive. Every archival record, every selection, every omission is a political act." For those of you who don't know, Vern Harris has been the archivist for the papers of Nelson Mandela since 2004, and is the head of the memory program at the Nelson Mandela Foundation Center of Memory and Dialogue. So what happens when neutrality becomes unethical? So attempting to be fully neutral can become actively unethical when it legitimizes past injustices by preserving racist, sexist, or colonialist descriptions without acknowledging harm or adding context. It erases marginalized voices by failing to proactively collect and preserve records from underrepresented communities. It allows AI or computational bias to go unchecked by letting machine-generated metadata mislabel, decontextualize, or suppress materials. And then that leaves us with the ethical alternative. So rather than striving for false neutrality, many modern archivists advocate for critical archival practice, which includes transparency, first and foremost, acknowledging why and how archival decisions are made, contextualization, adding historical explanations to problematic records instead of simply preserving them as is, and inclusive collecting, so proactively ensuring that marginalized histories are represented. And then I also just added a quote from Octavia Butler, who's one of my favorite sci-fi authors. It felt topical. Now, so the role of the archivist in digitization and the historical practice of commercial copy work may seem similar. Both involve the reproduction of images, but they have fundamentally different objectives, ethics, and methodologies. The archivist's role in digitization is to preserve, contextualize, and provide access to historical records without altering their meaning or materiality. See the earlier slides, though. Commercial copy photography is a historical practice where photographers were hired to replicate artworks, prints, or other photographs for commercial or artistic purposes, oftentimes enhancing or modifying the original to meet market expectations. Now, this is a very important distinction to make because many practitioners within the cultural heritage environment act and reference commercial practices rather than take on the role and responsibilities of the critical archivist. So let's look at an example of this within photo history. Many of you may recognize this digital image representing the earliest surviving photograph to be made with a camera. It's done by Joseph Nicephore Niepce, untitled, but view from the window at Le Gras, circa 1826, 1827. This object was rediscovered in 1952 by photo historians Helmut and Alison Gernsheim on a property in Surrey. It was first depicted to the public in this well-known reproduction that was approved by Helmut Gernsheim prior to its international release. When Gernsheim first held the object, it appeared to be a mirror in a gilded frame. As he tilted it slightly toward the light, like you may a daguerreotype, still nothing. Tilt it even further, and voila, the date of photography's discovery just went back 13 years. From this description, you can imagine that this would be a difficult object to photograph, and it was. After several attempts, and even one by Scotland Yard, Kodak engineers managed to make a photograph of the pewter plate. But the result is covered in dust, and the non-planarity of the plate caused unwanted reflections. So Gernsheim, unhappy with the gelatin silver print reproduction, retouches the print with watercolor. So this watercolor became the most widely distributed representation of the object. Now, 50 years later, in 2002, the plate allowed to be photographed by the Harry Ransom Center and the J. Paul Getty Museum. Here. Now, your understanding of this object, even with my prior verbal description, your understanding of this object and even perhaps the process of how it was made is instant. Here in this reproduction, they are prioritizing the materiality as well as the image. This earlier famous reproduction of View from the Window at Le Gras represents one of the earliest instances of material transformation through reproduction. The way the image was interpreted, transformed, and restricted through reproduction, especially by Helmut Gernsheim, demonstrates how digitized and mediated copies can alter the understanding of an original artifact. So this, I found this image recently on the Harry Ransom Center website that you can download. There was no caption available for it, but I did find some information. This is the file name. I'm assuming this is the accession number, and that was also part of the original caption. This was probably taken in 2020. It's the recto, the front. Also, I pulled all the metadata out, so you can see, maybe it's hard to read, but I'll just read it to you. The creation date was 2019. The modification date was a year later in 2020. What those modifications were, I don't know, because that's not recorded. I know the camera, the lens, the exposure, the image size. So it's a little bit more transparent. It looks like they're using a target, so I can actually check to make sure that the color profiling is correct. And I don't know if any of you noticed, but out of all of these images, one thing that's missing is an image of the verso, which I'd love to see that. And I know that they photographed it because if you go there, they have a huge reproduction on the wall of the verso, but it's not available on their website. So what changed? The material surface was erased, the metallic sheen and chemical texture were removed, making this heliograph appear as a flat image rather than a relief. It's like hardened bitumen of Judea on the plate, so it is slightly topographical. So contrast was artificially enhanced. The original was low contrast and difficult to see, but the reproduction interpreted shadows and highlights, potentially misrepresenting Niepce's actual exposure results. Viewing conditions were changed. The heliograph required a reflective angle to see the image properly, but the watercolor made it appear fixed and static. So it is important to acknowledge that the process of this object's creation was as important, if not more, as the image itself. One thing I just wanted to point out is you can tell that this object was lit at a very extreme raking light. You can see the shadows of even the targets. And this is not typical lighting, copy stand lighting, where you'd have diffuse Lambertian reflected light, how your naked eye might see the object. So I'd really love to see that lighting as well, so I could understand maybe what this blank mirror-like plate looked like. But still a far cry from the original watercolor. So this is just another example of an object. This is a thermoplastic case. You can tell from the caption that there are photographic objects inside the case, but with this image you can't see what they look like or what they are, so a little bit of missing information. So this is much better. You have the interior of the case. We don't have the verso. Like I said, the caption tells us there are 4 photographic objects, but now that I know that there was a missing maybe photographic object that I wouldn't have known about before, the caption tells us that there are 2 daguerreotypes, 1 tintype and 1 ambrotype. And maybe if you have a very well-educated eye, you could figure out which is which. But if you just light it differently, you can see that the daguerreotypes appear very different under the specular light. Now, let's talk about photographic negatives from a commercial perspective. So when digitizing a negative, typically you use transmitted light, so light passing through the object, the emulsion facing the sensor, either towards the scanner or towards the camera sensor. Then you might remove the color information or alter the color information. You'd both invert and reverse laterally, and then crop. And that would be sort of what you're trying to get to. That's the final image. Then you might do some dust and scratches. You might enlarge the digital file for print reproduction, and that's what you access. So from an archival perspective, you're wanting to record the object. So this is what the object is. You may want to eventually make that positive version, so you're still gonna scan it properly as to commercial practices, but you might also use additional lighting methods. So this is transmitted light. This is Lambertian reflected light, so that's what the object looks like to the naked eye. And then this is specular light. So all of a sudden you can see a lot of information. Bernice Abbott was doing some retouching, all that would have been lost if we just digitized it in this commercial way. So you can also make the secondary version, making sure that maybe your metadata or your captions are just reflecting what you've done in post. And then you can, I'm not gonna go into this because you're gonna have a talk later, but pictorIA is a viewer that perhaps allows for multiple views and versions of an image, supporting transparency in how images are interpreted, cropped, or annotated. So in effect, it creates a multi-perspectival archive, one that supports comparison, critique, and historical complexity. It just provides a more well-rounded understanding of the object. So these interactive viewers, a lot of the functionality is open source, so you can learn to build one for your own institution. So I was just thinking about something interesting while looking at this grid of images, and I don't know if you've ever heard about quantum image processing. I'm just gonna jump a little bit beyond the AI discussion. When people talk about AI, you often hear a lot about natural language processing models, generative models for images, or computer vision, facial recognition, object detection, edge detection, that kind of thing. But something that's starting to come up more in discussions is quantum image processing. So what does that mean? So we all know the traditional computing is binary. So it operates on bits, which are either on or off, representing two possible states. It's like having a light switch, on or off. Each computation is framed by this binary choice, representing by state A or state non-A. So for example, you have this image, or you have this image, or you have this image, or you don't have all of them at once, okay? But when we move into quantum computing, things change radically. Quantum computing leverages quantum bits, they're called qubits, which aren't limited to just being on or off. Instead, they can be in multiple states at once. Like I said, the light switch, think of a dimmer switch, so it can be on and off in every state in between. And this allows superposition, so it allows all of these states to happen simultaneously. So a quantum bit can hold more information than a traditional binary bit. Why am I talking about this? So let's think about how this could be applied to image processing, the idea of quantum images. And this is just an imagined idea because quantum image processing isn't doing this right now. This is just an imagined future. So rather than needing to choose between a single representation of an image, let's just say the reflected light off the surface or just the transmitted light, a quantum image, an imagined quantum image, could simultaneously represent multiple light interactions at once. Imagine that one pixel in an image could simultaneously represent reflected light, transmitted light, specular light, and maybe even diffuse or refracted light all at once. So this would mean that quantum images could have high resolution spatially, but they could also be high resolution spectrally, capturing different types of light interactions. And who knows, maybe in the future they can even capture temporal resolution, meaning a pixel could represent multiple moments in time. So right now, quantum computing work focuses on things like compression algorithms. How can we fit more information to smaller file sizes, which is getting really, really complex. So, this is just an imagined thought experiment, which I think is important when you're doing the digitization, to not just do your immediate need. I just need these images for a publication, so I'm just going to digitize them the way I need for the publication. Try to imagine future desires of researchers. Let's move on from quantum computing. Okay, so this is an image made by Bernice Abbott. You can tell from the caption that it's actually a negative. So why do we have this image? In your mind, you can just deduce, oh, well, this is just the positive inverted image that they've created. Sure, it's not that simple. So this is the negative. This is what the object looks like under diffused Lambertian reflected light. And I'm just going to invert it for you and laterally reverse. Don't forget that step. And then if you look really close, you can see her signature there. So this is actually a print mounted to board that's been rephotographed. So the image I showed you before is sort of implying that the negative we have was the original of the image, but it's actually not. So you can see how complicated this already gets. The first negative, and I'm assuming who knows how many multiple iterations I'm skipping, but the first negative was taken by Bernice. She made a print, mounted to board and signed. She or someone else made the repro negative, cropped into the board. So we're losing a little bit of information of the board. Then the archive is creating a digitized negative, then they're cropping it, then they're inverting and reversing it. So all these red stages are just losing more and more information and context. I just have this to show you the different phases, how maybe in a IIIF viewer you could view these simultaneously. And this is really important because a lot of these objects are deteriorating, so capturing the stage of where they are at this moment in time. When I showed that metadata, having the date that the image was created is so important, because when you look at something online, you're like, okay, sure, was this painting or photograph digitized in 2000, or was it digitized yesterday? Because it might look totally different today than it did. Okay, so while the shift from physical photographic archives to digital AI-mediated systems is often framed as a radical rupture, it can also be understood as a continuation of photography's inherent process of translation. Photography has always been a medium of transformation, moving from one state to another rather than remaining on a fixed or stable object. From the earliest days of negative to positive printing to enlargement, retouching, and chemical manipulation in the darkroom, and onto digital post-processing, every stage of photographic history has involved acts of interpretation, transformation, and remediation. In this light, digitization and even certain AI tools do not necessarily present a break from photography's nature, but rather an intensification of their foundational qualities. They accelerate processes that were already implicit in photography's development. AI-based restoration is a digital form of retouching, like early photographers who scratched out blemishes on negatives or hand-painted photographs. Today's AI tools remove noise, interpolate missing details, and sometimes even fabricate content not present in the original. So despite this continuity, AI introduces fundamental discontinuities that challenge the historical foundations of photographic and archival practice. One, mainly loss of human intentionality. Two, pattern recognition over indexicality. So it is precisely at this threshold where AI threatens to transform photographs into decontextualized data that the archive asserts its unique and vital role. While photography may indeed be a medium of translation, archives and archivists are not simply intermediaries in that chain. They are custodians of the object, context, and cultural memory. Their responsibility is not just to transmit, but to stabilize, to preserve the trace, and to document every act of transformation. archival description, provenance records, finding aids, and conservation decisions are all acts of ethical and historical framing. They are deliberate interventions that shape how photographs are interpreted, not by machine pattern recognition, but by a human framework of memory, justice, and social context. So archives and museums have always had this dual responsibility of preserving the historical evidence and to act as trusted repositories of public knowledge. So this is not necessarily a crisis of technology, it's a crisis of responsibility and representation. So archives must position themselves not merely as repositories of content, but as ethical stewards of historical meaning in a landscape increasingly shaped by synthetic systems. So this leads us to what scholars of AI ethics have termed the responsibility gap, a situation in which decisions made by algorithmic systems lack a clearly accountable human agent. In archival contexts, this gap emerges when AI auto-generates metadata that is incorrect or biased, reconstructs images in speculative ways, and when users engage only with AI-generated descriptions or summaries rather than full objects or contextual records. The core problem is this. When AI makes interpretive decisions without documentation, oversight, or ethical framing, who is responsible for the consequences? The archivist's authority is eroded not only by automation, but by a system that obscures the provenance of the transformation itself. This is especially troubling in photographic archives where meaning is tightly bound to the material, historical, and indexical presence. So to address this challenge, archives just simply must build resilient infrastructures that reassert curatorial responsibility and reinforce trust through transparency and care. So transparency is the foundation of trust in archival systems. Without it, human and AI-generated metadata, edits, or restorations risk being accepted as authentic without qualification. So the Content Authenticity Initiative, which if you haven't heard of it, you should look it up after. It was launched by Adobe, the New York Times, and others. It is a leading model. It embeds cryptographically sealed metadata into images, tracking the creator of the image, what tools were used to modify it, including AI, and when and how changes were made. This is different than other metadata which can be edited. It's locked. So this approach treats images like archival documents, preserving a chain of custody that allows researchers and the public to verify authenticity and understand how a digital object has been altered. And I'll just, if you're not familiar with them, I'll just give you an example here. So I'm not going to show you this graphic video that was posted on the BBC, but what they're doing now is they're implementing these content credentials. So you can see the CR logo, content credentials, all images. A lot of photojournalists are using this technology. It's really important that they're trusted, but I really feel like archives could use this potentially, I imagine. But I will show you what this looks like when you look at the metadata. Maybe hard to read, but I'll just sort of walk you through this. It says, basic summary, it was originally posted on TikTok. It was created March 6th of 2024. It gives the coordinates, the location of when it was taken. Verification checks, it says that it was originally posted on March 2nd, so a few days earlier, by someone else. They've matched the gravestones, they've matched lighting direction to verify the location of the video. They also identified that the audio on the video, the gunfire, actually comes from a different video. And the second half of the video was from another video as well that was posted a few weeks earlier on Facebook by this user on this date. And I don't think that they've implemented this yet, but they were imagining that you could watch a video and the sort of timeline tracker would go red if it noticed any edits or AI manipulation. And in photographs, they're imagining that might look like, like a red square around the area that you could roll over and see what's been manipulated. Okay, so standard IIIF, again, I won't go too deep into viewing these things in different states, having these viewers. And then comes standard digitization. So materiality-aware standards. So I have FAGI and Metamorphose. The digitization process is not neutral. I'll just reiterate. It is an interpretive act that can either honor or flatten the material qualities of photographic objects. So standards like FAGI, the federal agency's digital guidelines initiative that's used primarily in North America, and Metamorphose in the Netherlands and most of Europe, are designed to preserve photographic materiality, providing clear benchmarks for resolution, tonal accuracy, and documentation of the object's current physical state. So these standards act as a form of structured resistance to the flattening effects of both human, AI, and computational image processing. So by insisting on high-fidelity, context-rich digitization, archives ensure that future AI systems are trained on well-documented and historically grounded material, rather than clean, context-free reproductions. So when Gernsheim tilted that pewter plate into the light and saw, for the first time in over a century, a faint view from a window, he wasn't just recovering an image. He was witnessing the fragile intersection of materiality, light, and interpretation. And just as Gernsheim painted in what he thought should be there, we too are at risk of painting over the complexity of our past with tools that promise clarity, but offer it at the cost of context. So let's not be passive witnesses in this transformation. Let us be critical, ethical humans in the loop, custodians not just of images, but of the labor, ethics, and decisions behind every reproduction. Because as Octavia Butler reminds us, all that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. Thanks. Oh.
Yeah, it's working. So thank you very much, Laura, for your this first lecture, which really enlightens the work in the making of images and the making of digitization. Something that we should never forget, even though I think photographs are really calling for that. To not see the mediation all the time. Thank you very much for this. We have about 10 minutes for questions, and I can see Jules in the back who has a mic. Please wait for the mic to come, since we are recording the lecture and we will broadcast it later on. Jules, we have a question at the front, please.
Thank you for your presentation.
Thanks.
Does the NIEPS window still exist, and the scene out the window still exist as he took it?
The object still exists, or do you mean the location?
Location.
Yeah, I believe there's a museum there that you can go and actually, I've never been, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you can go in and look through the window. Is that right?
There is a private owned museum, yes, in the house.
So modern photography has done an identical point of view of that old photo.
You can find online multiple versions of other people, and also, I didn't show this, but they've painted it in, or they've explained what things are. It's like the window shutters, so they outline that. But I don't know if I've seen a contemporary image.
Because they could duplicate the lighting conditions and so on of the time of day.
Absolutely.
And so on.
I will say, I think the original took many hours of exposure, so
12.
it's, okay. So it's not like an instant moment in time. That's
No.
why it's soft and, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Other questions, comments? Yes, Aaron, here in the...
So I'm curious about the algorithmic generation that happens inside the digital camera during the digitization process or scanner, or however it's captured. A lot of the times, these formulations are copyrighted and protected, and the archivist doesn't have access to this kind of information. But is it possible that these things can also be recorded in the metadata and then maybe made available later, so that once these formulations become available, that we can kind of understand better how that process happened?
That's such a great question. Thank you. This is a huge issue because, especially with imaging specialists working in museums, they're trying to do something what's called scene-referred imaging. So the image of Niepce that I showed you with just the color target, for example, that's an example of scene-referred imaging, so that people can duplicate it potentially in the future. The problem is with these sort of baked-in algorithms in cameras. So Canon versus Nikon, they have all these like very unique ways to interpolate the pixel data, and I've been in meetings where they've tried to get people to come together to come up with a camera that's like a base standard, but I don't believe it's ever going to happen. There's always going to be that margin of change. And the question about recording that, yeah, I mean, I guess like in the camera metadata, you would have that it was taken with a Canon versus a Nikon. I'm just picking on the big companies, but so I guess you could at that point deduce what it may have been, but yeah, we're getting into the fine details there, but you're absolutely right.
I just have a comment to that. Stereophotography is good for detecting AI changes. On flat photos, you can sometimes not differentiate pixels, but when you've got a stereo.
Oh, interesting. Yeah,
You can see exactly what's been altered.
probably an alignment type of.
Yes, we have a question in the back. Sarah, there.
Hi, thanks, Laura. For someone who's maybe just in digitization but doesn't really know where to start with AI, what like resources or tools would you recommend, or for people or institutions that maybe have like a lack of funding for these resources, where would you look, or what do you think the best place to start would be?
Yeah, that's really great. And something that I didn't mention, so I'm going to take advantage of your question to share this. Thank you. I understand that a lot of institutions aren't going to be able to photograph everything in multiple ways. This is just to be aware of it and to make a very educated decision on what you're going to do and be transparent about it. A lot of that comes down to time. A lot of people who are doing the digitization spend so much time with asset management. I would strongly urge you, anyone who's interested, to learn a little bit of Python. There are a lot of open, free tutorials that can teach you to just manage files so that you can leave your brain, let the computer do what it's built to do, and you can spend your time actually creating context. I would also suggest going to the Content Authenticity Initiative webpage. They have a lot of free visual literacy courses online that are really incredible for all grade levels, children to adult. So that's where I'd start.
Good start. There is oh, yeah. Francis has a question. Just Jules at the end. Yeah.
Hi. So it seems to me, sorry, that what you're describing is a situation in which maybe digital object files need to have metadata sets for the original object, and then also at least one metadata set for each individual image that is attached to the file. It reminds me of research I recently did on space photography, where I went into the NASA database trying to look at their metadata, and it's just like nested and nested folders of metadata, most of which made absolutely no sense to me, so I barely could look at it. And I wonder if there's precedent, or you have thought about how that could be managed in a way that you can organize and present it to users of a database that they'll be able to make sense of it. So all that information doesn't essentially become lost because it's unusable.
Yeah, that's another translation issue that I'm really glad that you brought up NASA, because I frequently reference their standards. Even archivists have standards that they follow and use syntax languages that other people may not be able to read. So you sort of have to have this key to understand how to read the information. But yeah, again, that's a problem. I mean, not even to get into someone in the future that's trying to read a digital file, and you have a Blu-ray player to play this disc that I mean, it's already happening. So the medium to actually read the information is a huge problem. And there are people that are going deep into trying to write data on optical discs that you can read with a scanning electron microscope, so at least you can see the information with your human eye rather than needing a computer to translate that. But I mean, that's a huge problem. So, I mean, good question, but we're working on it. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. We have just maybe a last question here. Yeah, thank you.
Very good presentation. How do you manage getting into the weeds of being over-informed? Because to the average individual looking at something, you can say, yes, this was digitized, this was AI, but of what importance is that? You know, to the average individual. If you're in the trench of technology with photography, it makes a lot of sense. But how does that relate to the ordinary individual?
So I think I would just go back to, and this is sort of the point I was trying to make. Sure, we can record all this metadata, we can use these tools to read the metadata and try to make it easier to understand. But sorry, let's go here. When you have something like this, most of the public will look at that and just assume, oh, this is the earliest photograph. I'm assuming it was on paper. I'm assuming it was this way. And they're making all of these ideas, and maybe an archivist or someone in museums understands how to read the caption, maybe understands what a heliograph or that process means. But just by taking a proper object, focusing on the objecthood, focusing on the materiality, that gives the general public so much more information. So I think I would just say trying to get out of the idea of working from a commercial imaging perspective and just trying to show people information with the image rather than all of this metadata. Just be transparent as possible.
Thank you. The last one, maybe, yeah, a last question here.
When this gentleman posed that question, I thought immediately of your introduction around the importance of the integrity behind archiving material so that it's not abused and you don't have misinformation and it's not erased and all of that, which is so critical to transparency and truth. So I based on what the gentleman was saying, I think for the average human being, that is more important, if you're of African descent or Jewish or whatever, and you understand, what has happened through history when things are changed. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, and photographic objects are a very strange thing, because it seems like with other kinds of material artifacts, paintings and things, we don't have a material issue, but photographs a lot of the times just read as image. And so when communities lose their collections or their objects, and then you're losing that trace of, oh, these objects were held or they were in an album and we understand that they were in this, like, how did the community understand these objects? All of that's not being recorded. So yeah, maybe that's sort of where you were going. But
Great. Thank you very much, Laura, for your presentation.